No engine, no car. I mean, that's pretty much a given if you're trying to go racing. But recently, I've been talking about the different engine manufacturers who supplied the back of the grid teams. Because when you have teams like Lotus and Brabham at the start of the 1990s who were starting their slide down into obscurity and, well, you know, not being in business anymore, if they could get free engines or very, very cheap engines, then that would keep them going for a little bit longer, despite the power deficit that having these cheap or free engines came with. So just as a reminder and a bit of an overview for anybody that is watching this stuff for the first time, I've looked at Yamaha, Mugen, and more recently, Hart. And I was bold enough to call Brian Hart the last proper garageista, because it was all on a shoestring budget, and it was mostly him with a few others, working with others, to get these engines working. Only for the F1 world to explode on the money front, and he was just going to be left standing while everybody else went forwards, simply because Brian couldn't spend what Mercedes, Renault and others were spending. So he sold his company to Tom Walkinshaw and left the engine business for good at the end of the 1997 season. But there was another independent engine manufacturer on the grid in the late 80s through to the late 90s that is still around today, and that manufacturer is Judd. Judd Engines began in 1971 as a joint venture between John Judd and Jack Brabham. Jack had recently sold his Formula 1 team to Bernie Ecclestone, and the company was set up in Rugby in Warwickshire. Yes, that rugby, as in the game that's a spin-off from football. And John Judd was in a prime place to get involved in engineering. At the time, Coventry, the closest city to rugby, was a centre of engineering, and most people worked either with cars or aircraft. And there was also the Coventry Climax Engine Company, or just Coventry Engine Company, that built the Climax engine. And this engine was often found in things like Coopers, BRMs, Lotuses, and other small British garageista racing cars. John had originally tried to get a job at Jaguar, but couldn't get an apprenticeship, but because his dad worked for Coventry Engines, some strings got pulled. By the mid-1960s, Judd had been employed at Motor Racing Developments, because he'd been introduced to Jack Brabham via Harry Spears, who worked at the Coventry Engine Company. The business was set up to develop engines for Brabham's racing efforts, such as the Repco engines in Formula 1 and Honda's in Formula 2, before taking on Honda's again when Honda returned to Formula 2 in the 1980s, which we'll get to in a second. In Formula 1, Brabham had never used Honda power, but in Formula 2 they, or we, had, and dominated Formula 2 in 1966. So after Jack and Ron sold the team, he and Judd set up this new venture. I say it was a new venture, they just took Jack Brabham Conversions, which had just ceased trading, and renamed it Engine Developments. For the 1966 season, Brabham had got Repco to build that monster V8, and John started working for him in the March of that year. The 1966 season is the year that Jack became the first man, and so far only man, to win the championship in a car that had his own name on it. But what about Enzo? Find me where Enzo Ferrari won the World Championship as a driver. Look, I'm just covering my arse here. Somebody was going to say it. If anything, it just shows that I've been doing this far too long. But while John was doing bits and pieces for Brabham in 1966, he maintains that he had very little, if anything, to do with that Repco engine. 67, he had some input though. The company almost went under early doors, but a contract from Ford Australia helped save the company. After this, they got heavily involved with the rebuilding of Ford DFVs and prepping DFVs for several Formula 1 teams. In 1974, Ron Toranac, who founded Motor Racing Developments with Jack, set up Rolt. And you might have heard the name Rolt before. Much like Cosworth, March, Arrows, Aber and Ilmore, Rolt was one of those names where the founders all put their names down and made it into a word. In this case, it was Ron and Austin Lewis Toranac, R-A-L-T, Rolt. It was the two brothers. Ayrton Senna was driving one of their chassis in Formula 3 in 1983, and he parked one of their chassis on top of Martin Brundle's head in one of their many battles in that category. In 1979, Senna's first Formula 1 team in Tolman used Rolts. There's probably one massive spider diagram linking every single one, and I mean every single Storytime episode together. Even the IndyCar Rally and NASCAR stuff is probably connected to other bits and pieces. In 1980, Honda was back in Formula 2 and Judd's company was preparing the engines for Rolt. Formula 2 went bust in 1984 to be rebadged later on as Formula 3000, but even then, Judd continued to develop the engines for Honda. Judd had also become a leading supplier of Super V engines, those Volkswagen ones. But the 1980 Formula 2 season, the first season that Honda was back in that particular category, did not go well. 1981 was slightly better, but that engine that they developed, this little V6, was still rough around the edges. So Ron Toranak went to the Judd factory in Rugby with the head of research and development at Honda. The engine was on the dyno, but John had noticed they were running the engine too lean, and with some changes to the ignition timing they could get another 20 to 30 horsepower. Jeff Lees was given the bodged engine for the Spa round of 1981 and dominated it with no clutch. Needless to say, Judd had won the respect of Honda, and when Formula 2 went under in 1984, Honda said, "You think you can do us an engine for kart?" Gallows Racing became the first to use a Judd-prepped Honda turbo in 1986, with Jack's eldest son Jeff at the wheel. This engine debuted mid-season and was badged as a Brabham Honda, with the best result coming at Michigan, where Jeff scored a 4th place finish, and went better still in 1987, with a 2nd place at Pocono and also at Road America. Because Judd already had experience with the DFX, which was the IndyCar version of the DFV, they could do their own engines based off what they'd learned from those. Honda supported the project much like they did with the Mugen stuff, and just let Judd get on with it. It was quite economical, and that's why it did so well at 500-mile races, but it was still down on power compared to the Chevrolet engines at the time. In 1988, the engine was now a Judd, the AV to be precise, and was now in the hands of True Sports, with their driver, Bobby Rahal. The engine would power them to 3rd in the championship, with a smattering of top 10 finishes. 2nd at Long Beach, 2nd at Cleveland, another 2nd at Michigan, and then a win at Pocono and 2nd at Road America being the highlights. True Sports would keep Judd engines until 1991. But also in 1988, things were changing in Formula 1, and Judd was about to go into business with several of the teams over there. In 1988, there was a switchover beginning. Turbos would be outlawed for 1989, but if anybody wanted to carry on using turbos through 88, they could. McLaren and Honda kept the turbos and dominated the season, having 15 out of the 16 pole positions and 15 out of the 16 race victories, in probably the most dominant season on record. And the reason I say that is, they were faster every race, whereas the 2023 Red Bull was off the pace completely at Singapore, and it was driver error from a lapped car that stopped the clean sweep for McLaren. Tangent aside, Judd's plan with going into Formula 1 was to offer the DFV 2.0, even though Ford already had the DFV 2.0 in the DFR and the DFZ. Judd's offering was supposed to be similar to the original design of the DFV, being an off-the-shelf option that would fit into a car and be ready to rock, and almost be part of the 1990s plucky privateer starter pack. You know how in the 70s it was March chassis, Hewland gearbox and a DFV? Just replace DFV with Judd. And the Ford engine was starting to fall out of favour at this time. In 1988, Benetton, Tyrrell, Real, Minardi, LaRue Dallara, AGS, Coloni and Eurobrunn were all using Ford DFV descendants. March, later the Leighton House team, were Judd's primary partner for the 1988 season, with Williams being a late supply contract due to them losing the Honda engines as they went to McLaren. And this would be a good opportunity for the company. You had the reigning Constructors' Champions to help them develop, on top of March and Ligier, with Ligier being the 3rd team to sign on for that year. March actually ended up finishing ahead of Williams because the FW12 was an absolute dog, and when Williams lost the Honda contract, Honda had actually told them to give Judd a call, because they'd had that relationship in the past, and Honda thought that Judd would be a good fit for Williams. Finishing races wasn't for everybody, but for most teams it was just get 1988 out of the way and focus on 89. Williams was just hanging on with whatever they could get until they got something new, and Judd was merely a stopgap. Patrick Head admitted the engine was good, but Williams was playing with an early version of their active suspension system. The oil was getting too hot and frying the engine. That said though, the CV engine that Judd supplied to the 3 teams was the most powerful of the non-turbos that year, and the marches of Ivan Capelli and Mauricio Gugelmin in their newly designed car were consistently faster than the Ford-powered offerings in the speed traps. Gugelmin clocked the fastest speed for a naturally aspirated car at Hockenheim, with his fastest speed being 194 miles an hour, which at the time made Monza look slow. It makes you wonder how fast the hybrids would be at the old Hockenheim, but they'd probably run out of battery after 2 laps. 194 miles an hour is pretty good, but the McLaren got clocked at 207, so yeah, still some work to do. But at the Japanese Grand Prix of 1988, one of the March cars ended up in the lead, briefly, and it was the first time since 1983 that a naturally aspirated car had led a race. And it was a V8, not a V10. In 1989, Williams began their relationship with Renault and Ligier went back to Ford. Judd's supply of V8s was now sent to Brabham and Lotus, as well as March, who were the only team to retain the engine supply. The new EV was given to Brabham, but the CV was used by Lotus, with March getting the EV a little bit later on and starting the season with the CV. The new EV engine had a narrower V-angle to make it more compact, and as a fun bit of bonus trivia, it was a 76-degree angle because the CNC equipment at Judd wouldn't go to 75. It only went in even number increments, so it had to be 76. I mean, it could have been 74, but they chose 76. Both Brabham and March managed to score a podium with this new engine, Brabham getting theirs at Monaco while March got theirs at the season opener at Brazil. Lotus was the best performing team of the three, finishing 6th in the Constructors' Championship thanks to, well, actually finishing races. Lotus managed a 4th in Canada, another 4th at Silverstone, a 5th at Hockenheim, 6th in Hungary, and another 4th place at Japan. March's podium finish in Brazil was the only points finish for the team that season, Arrow's 1999 style. But by the time 1990 rolled around, it was clear that a V10 was the engine to have. V12s were powerful, but they were heavy and thirsty. V8s were lighter and more frugal, but they had less power. So a V10 was firmly within the Goldilocks zone when it came to racing engines. So, moving on towards 1991, and Judd brought the GV V10. Judd was now able to give teams about 750 horsepower, which was very respectable for the time. And it showed when the Scuderia Italia team, or the Dallara team, whatever you want to call them, got a podium at Imola. Pre-Tamburello and Villeneuve chicanes Imola as well. Dallara was the only team of the two supplied, the other being Lotus, to have this V10. Brabham had taken a supply of Yamaha V12s, and March, which was now late in house, was using Ilmors, with Ilmor probably a history piece for the future considering what they've achieved on both sides of the Atlantic. Dallara's points scored didn't get much better than the 3rd place at Imola. A 6th place at the next round at Monaco was all they got, while Lotus could only get a 5th and 6th at Imola. Both teams were subject to either non-qualifications or no pre-qualifications, as both teams were hovering in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lotus had a revolving door of drivers in that second car alongside Mika Hakkinen. Julian Bailey, Johnny Herbert and Michael Bartels all drove that car at some point. But I've covered Lotus's downfall before in the Downfall mini-series. But at the same time, it shows how there is crossover, because if you're offering cheap engines, those without the money will take whatever you have, no matter how crap it is. Lotus was using an outdated V8. For 1992 though, Judd would not finish the season. Both the teams that they supplied that year with the EV V10, which were Brabham and Andrea Moda, were both gone by the Belgian Grand Prix. Brabham had folded after the Hungarian Grand Prix, and Andrea Moda was told not to turn up at the Belgian Grand Prix because they brought the sport into disrepute. They're the only team to ever be kicked out of a Formula 1 season, and it's also the first ever episode of this series. See, I told you, everything links together at some point. It's mad. So Judd was now out of Formula 1. At least they were out as Judd, because following the demise of Brabham and Andrea Moda, John turned to Yamaha and offered them the GV V10 that they were supposed to be using for 1993. Yamaha took the GV, rebranded it the OX10 and sold it to Tyrrell, which, if you've seen my video on Yamaha, you might have heard me refer to them in passing towards the end of the video, Judd that is, saying that Yamaha's engines were often called rebadged Judds, and they hadn't really built those engines themselves. It was something that came up in the comments on that Yamaha video. You didn't mention the Judd thing, because it really wasn't that deep. Yamaha paid Judd to build their engines, Yamaha then stuck their name on it, and proceeded to have them blow up at nearly every race. John must have made a fortune in rebuilds. But teaming up with Yamaha was actually the best option for Judd, because as Brian Hart found out, the manufacturers were just going to simply outspend, and the only way to actually make it somewhere was to team up. There were accusations that Yamaha was just casing the joint, as it were, for Toyota, given that Yamaha and Toyota had a relationship and Toyota was considering entering Formula 1. As mentioned in the Yamaha video, an evolution of the early Yamaha V12 that was in the Brabham and Tyrrell in the early 90s was downsized to a V10 and then became the power plant for the Lexus LFA. Yamaha denied that accusation, much like they denied that they were running John's engines with a new sticker on them. But I won't recap the Tyrrell and Arrow's years simply because I've done all that already, and Yamaha has its own dedicated video which you can watch in your own time if you want to. These days, Judd is still in business. The company is run by his son now, but John still goes into work, even though he's in his 80s because, as he told Autosport, it's better than the golf course. Since leaving Formula 1, Judd effectively won the 1999 British Touring Car Championship, as it was a Judd-prepped engine that powered Laurent Aiello's Nissan Primera to the title, and modified versions of that 1991 V10 won 4 titles in endurance racing between 2002 and 2006. Between 1996 and 2004, the Formula 3000 engines were Zytex, but using Judd components. But there was one setback to the company's reputation. In 2012, Lotus went to IndyCar and the Indy 500 with Simona Di Silvestro and Jean Alesi taking part, and the cars ran into trouble. Alesi and Silvestro were black flagged for being too slow. The engine was badged as a Lotus, but it was a Judd engine, and because Lotus was in the midst of some, well, let's just call it corporate chaos, it didn't go to plan. But most recently, Judd engines were found in LMP2s up until about 2016. Now they're Gibsons or Nissans or something along those lines, but Judd has actually said he's not really interested in doing one make series. He gets more satisfaction out of doing like reverse engineering and putting his engines into historic cars. Judd was probably the only so-called independent to emerge out the other side of that late 90s boom of manufacturer involvement in Formula 1, able to do what many of the contemporaries couldn't. As we've seen in most of the downfall videos such as with Jordan, Lotus and so on, not having a manufacturer deal or having a factory engine supply kind of crippled those teams, although in the case of Lotus and Brabham there was a bit of mismanagement as well. Minardi too, come to think of it. Not mismanaged, but certainly left to rot through no real factory connections. Jordan was shafted by Honda. Lotus dumped by Honda. It seems like there's a pattern here. So Judd teaming with Yamaha was the best thing that the company could have done. It effectively kept them in business because they had Yamaha putting the money in for Judd to build the engines for Yamaha, and then Yamaha took the reputation hit because they just kept on blowing up. I don't really know exactly how it worked. I think Yamaha just simply paid Judd to build the engines for them instead of Yamaha doing it itself, but that's something that somebody who's a bit more internet savvy or a bit more, I don't know, anarchy to answer down in the comments. But considering how many of his contemporaries fell by the wayside, not just in engine manufacturers and teams, it's good to see that somebody came out the other side. So then, a look at John Judd and the Judd Engine Company that he founded with Sir Jack Brabham. If this has been interesting for you, then do leave the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep things running around here, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.